Hi. So when we look at modern art, we tend to notice what's true, which is that we're looking at art now that's got a very conceptual side to it, kind of a philosophical side to it. It's 20th century art is an art, among other things, of ideas. And looking at art like that, it's natural to think, well, there's also a certain process of appreciating this art that's different from the process that I've used all my life to appreciate other art objects. Um, and I think I would want to challenge that a little bit today, although we are going to spend most of our time today talking about some conceptual ideas and some abstractions that underlie a certain movement of art. But what I wanted to say before we get to that was this: all through the humanities, whether we're talking about ancient stuff or Renaissance stuff or modern stuff, as I've said, for me, a basic criterion is that I think it's cool. It's deliberately vague. I think it's cool. What does that mean? Does it mean I think it's beautiful? On some level, I guess it means that I think it's beautiful. One of the things that we see when we look at 20th century art is this whole classical notion of beauty and the sublime, this sort of classical idealist approach to art has kind of been thoroughly exploded pretty much by the time we get past the modernist movement, I think. But you might think that, gee, these sophisticated cosmopolitans at the art gallery, they come in with some sort of intellectual conversation that they're already a part of and some philosophical ideas that they already understand. And then they are giving their appraising looks at these art objects and seeing how they enter into this conversation. Well, that's true of some people, but I've tried to show you along the way with these videos that it's can be something much more visceral than that. I didn't look. I found the paintings by El Greco. I thought they were really cool. I'll just use that technical term, cool, right? I thought they were really cool. I didn't know what they were. It led me to finding out about the Counter-Reformation art, about mannerism, and other things. And so that was a good discovery. So I saw the art first, and I thought it was interesting. There was something about it that attracted me. It was charismatic to me. And then I found out about it, and finding out about it was also rewarding. A more recent example are those color field theories by Mark Rothko that we were looking at when we were thinking about abstract expressionism. Again, I encountered those paintings, um, and I didn't know why anyone would make paintings like that or what those paintings were about, but I liked them a lot. I thought they were cool. And so subsequently, then I found out about them, and I mentioned Mark Rothko is one color field painter among several. He does have a very dramatic story in terms of the ideas that he's expressing and what he's trying to do with his canvases. So, so I found that out later, but in both cases there, I really liked the art. I didn't understand the art. I liked the art. I thought it was cool. It seemed charismatic to me. It seemed interesting to me. I didn't have to know why that was. Subsequently, then I have the further pleasure and the further enrichment of going and studying a little with you and finding out about some of the reasons why. So today I want to talk about a very interesting uh, movement. A movement, I think, among other things, one of the things I would want to stress today is that minimalism as a movement in art is extremely influential. I mean, it might seem to be very much the kind of thing. Sorry, I want to go back there. Very much. That's a Frank Stella painting, by the way. It might seem to be very much the kind of minimalism, very much the kind of art where people look at it and say, "Gee, I don't understand why those people are doing that," uh, or "I don't understand why people think that's art," or what we're supposed to be getting out of looking at something like that. I'm not sure that I want to explain my title here, Art Turned Inside Out. I'm not sure that minimalism is actually the best word. The artist we're going to look at most today is actually Donald Judd, because Donald Judd and Robert Morris, because those two are very philosophical and they write about their ideas, and they are kind of conceptual. And Judd, for one, very much objected to this word minimalism. I don't think minimalism is right, although I think if you say the minimalist aesthetic, that's something. Remember, minimalism is a broader term. In art, there's minimalist writing, there's minimalist music, minimalist composers, and that's actually really excellent art that I strongly recommend that you check out. People like John Cage, Philip Glass, Stephen Reich, and it's excellent music. So there are other minimalisms. There are other kinds of minimalism. We're looking at minimalism today mostly in what I would call studio art. Why? Because what minimalism is really all about, and really the reason why minimalism is actually not the greatest word for it, is that what's being called into question after the modernist movement and coming into then now the middle of the 20th century, and I'm going to explain to you in a second also how minimalism is indeed a reaction to abstract expressionism, in fact, and part of a larger dialectic. We'll get to that in the next slide. But one of the things that's happening with minimalism is that the artists are questioning what exactly it is that an artist does, and how that's done, and the very idea that there are objects, categories of objects like paintings or sculptures, and then more philosophically, the idea that there's a category of things called art. And so this is the philosophy of art full blown, right? So this is very philosophical questions that are being asked about what makes an object an art object, what the function of art is, what the meaning of art is, and among other things, these minimalists will be in more or less self-conscious revolt against a lot of traditional concepts like the concept of meaning. So again, the thing today is just to see what's happening with these minimalist artists of around the middle of the 20th century, why they're doing what they're doing. I think minimalism is a broad term. As I mentioned, these are very, very influential artists. I think art like conceptual art, installation art, performance art, a lot of these categories of art that we have today look to me to be subgenres of what is essentially minimalist art. Minimalist art, though, that is art not that tries to get to some minimum, which is odd. We'll see how it works, but why you would say such a thing. But art that is looking for the next mode of expression. Okay, so let's get to then this sort of dialectical history of art, the conceptual dialectic of art. Let's just go through this because, again, this is sort of talking about a dialectic that we've been looking at here when we're looking at art history. So you get this detachment of art from representation in the 19th century, and we see this when we're getting into the French Impressionists. So meaning, methods, and purpose of art. What even is art, and why do people do art? In a sense, it's up until I think it goes back and forth. I would say let me explain myself. I think the Impressionists and the abstract expressionists are people I would call humanists, the French Impressionists, and then the New York School abstract expressionists, humanists, because they want to get to a sort of looking at the nature of experience in the Impressionist case, in the abstract expressionist case, looking at human expression. Oh, that's of course tautologist, but thinking about action, right? So if the Impressionists are thinking about the phenomenal quality of experience, the expressionists are thinking about the sort of the creativity of action. And again, very self-consciously moving away from representation. Modernists and minimalists, I would argue, are sort of anti-humanists in a good way. I stress these connections between modernism and empiricism. And with Gertrude Stein, for example, her kind of approach to writing, which was also a kind of anti-Cartesian approach. And then the minimalists also, the minimalists find the abstract expressionists to be kind of all too human, that is, all too self-assertive, sort of running amok in this idea that they have, and yet still kind of in the context, in the boundaries of painting. The minimalists both want to get back to a kind of spiritual humility of the artist as being a vehicle, a servant, if you will, of expression of the time and the environment, an embedded being, and that is to say, a humble being. And so, and at the same time, a kind of naturalism. I say a kind of back to nature. Minimalism is back to nature. Big steel chrome cubes is back to nature. Well, I mean, if we're trying to understand minimalism at a superficial level, I think one thing that anyone just walking down the street would tell you, and it's not a dumb thing to say, would be that, well, look, we're looking at an industrial environment here. These minimalists are expressing or reflecting an environment that is an industrial environment, maybe a commodified environment, certainly an iterative manufactured environment. And that can be a kind of potted explanation of what the minimalist is doing. As I say, when we actually look at a couple of these artists right now, we'll find that their philosophical ideas, I think, are substantially deeper than that, and having to do not just with sort of the artist being embedded in an industrial environment, but also with the artist looking into the industrial world for new means of expression, literally new things for the artist to do. I think that's implied by kind of industrialization. So as I say, the one I want to look at really pretty much the most today is Donald Judd, because he's very philosophical. So what I'm trying to do here today is to kind of understand the intellectual motives of the minimalist artist. And we are going to look at a bunch of the art, so don't worry about that. We'll get to that in a sec. His 1965 essay, Specific Objects, is widely available. I just read it. It's very interesting. So what does he tell us about in that? Well, for one thing, think of this. Think of a painting, first of all, as a container. Container, that word he's using to emphasize kind of limits, narrowness, also formality, a container that you're going to put something into. The container for these kinds of humanistic expressions that are supposedly the purpose of the artist, to make these kinds of expressions. That's another thing that Judd and the other minimalists rebel against. I think, again, modernists do as well. So rudimentary methods of post-industrial expression. He has a really nice object. I almost made a slide for this about it. A bunch of little objects. They're really nondescript little industrial looking things. But Judd loved the manufacturing process. And one of the things that he loved about the process of making these little objects was that the green ones were green all the way through, he said, and the orange ones were orange all the way through. So it wasn't just the surface of the thing. He doesn't like the idea of a surface at all. He wants to sort of explode that surface. Hey, let's call it like the fifth wall. That's the canvas that's inside our four-dimensional space, right? And he wants to say, well, that's to an artificial kind of container. And he extended that to sculpture too. So he said, painting and sculpture are containers for these kind of Cartesian human expressions. And he really wanted to get beyond that altogether. So then he has this notion of materiality. that last bullet point. And I was just telling you about how he loved the manufacturing process of the object and thought that was his artistic statement at one point. So we want to get these unique objects, and very much anti-surface. He doesn't want there to be a surface because the surface is some kind of boundary between art and reality, between self and other, between the mind and the body. Of course, the concept of a surface is kind of a representational concept. So substance that is, again, not just metaphorically. I don't want to just, not that he doesn't want to be a superficial painter in the sense that he's a trite painter or something like that, but really very quite literally. As I said, he really liked the substance of his art object. He liked the idea that the color was something that was now infused all the way through it, for example. That's literally caring about substance, okay? And I think that's Donald Judd all the way. So, or even, for example, taking a canvas that's mounted on a frame and then just painting over the indentations and the wood, the hard wood surfaces under it and so on. Looking at structure, again, I think this is important. And when we think about Judd objecting to being called a minimalist, which he did, I think he saw himself as a kind of founder, a kind of pioneer. I think Judd was saying, look, from this new approach, which sort of empties out this sort of notion of meaning and intention and gets back to looking at structure in the same way that, say, a classical Chinese artist might look at nature, right? The naturalistic tradition of classical Chinese painting, looking at form, looking at these underlying forms. And then, of course, the interesting thing is that the underlying forms that we find are, this new manufactured kind of environment. Now, again, it's art that you look at. Sometimes people look at this art the way they look at, say, of Russian abstraction or something. They say, well, that stuff's just crazy, or what is that stuff? It's not really art. These are trite things to do. These are objects from the 1940s. Some of these objects are 1960s, 1970s. What I want to say is, I intentionally sort of didn't put a lot of dates on here because I wanted to get you to get the ideas. But anyway, what I want to say is that Donald Judd is enormously influential. I mean, office supplies, office design, interiors in general, approaches to ergonomics in general. You think, well, gosh, look at this silly artist, but Donald Judd's influence is everywhere. It's in your silverware. It's in your doorway. I mean, just a hugely influential artist. Not action art like Pollock, like the abstract expressionist. Action art, still an art that's a humanist art, where the artist is the star of the movie. Donald Judd doesn't want to be the star of the movie. He wants to be the sort of humble servant. And so he wants the viewer, or whatever you are going to call the person now, to engage. And so these experiments with space and surfaces are, in that sense, invitations to all of us to engage in the way that we're experiencing spaces and surfaces, to look at surfaces anew, looking at the manufactured repetitive surfaces anew. Also, pop art, Andy Warhol, all that kind of stuff. All of this stuff comes out of this minimalist movement. It's hugely important. And remember the little speech I made at the very beginning. I knew that I liked minimalist art a long time ago, a long time before I, had the time or wherewithal to find out very much about it. These are all Donald Judd installations, by the way. It really is very beautiful art, if you ask me. Again, there he is. It's one thing to conceive of the object, but you have to make a really high quality object. That's another really hard part of being an artist. As amateur wannabe artist, I find I can have an idea for making an object, but actually getting nice materials and doing things well is very difficult. And he makes these interesting environments. You're supposed to think and think about space. Minimalism, of course, is one of the things that makes minimalism so beautiful is it's got so much empty space in it. And it is a very totalizing kind of art. He went down to Marfa in West Texas. He wanted to, in these wide open spaces out in the semi-desert there, you know, he thought, well, the artist could work in a way that wasn't influenced by, say, the surrounding city of Paris and New York, or surrounding structures that weren't art structures. Just room for really something entirely new. And that's one of the things he liked about being outside. And of course, the whole notion of space. And he did quite a few of these. Also think about earthworks and everything coming out of minimalism. I really, once you start to think about the different genres of modern art and the different memes of modern art, and you look at minimalism, it's really a fountainhead of that stuff. So Frank Stella, I'm assuming maybe we know Mark Rothko, that is, we know what the sort of color field paintings look like. These color field paintings and Stella's sort of graphical explorations are transitional objects between abstract expressionism and minimalism. Something that he's doing, very similar to what Judd is doing, again, sort of handing things off to nature. And you saw with the Judd furniture, with the Judd interiors, you can see the influence that Judd has on contemporary design. I think when we look at these Frank Stellas and think about 1960s and 70s art, you'll see Stella's influence is also just a very towering. Sorry. Really, Mondrian, one of the only people coming before him. Frank Stella. And he also, it looks like these are frames because of the pictures of the art objects, but no, it looks like those gray areas are the frames, but those are just, I copied the pictures. These are cut out frames. Yes, in other words, it just has frames that aren't rectangular frames. And later he gets into really quite extravagant abstract sculptures that are really quite nice. I'm not sure what to make of them. I'm not sure where to put these large objects that he made later in his career in terms of art history. Last person, Robert Morris. Also because Morris is very philosophical, very self-consciously philosophical, very rebellious, very contrary. If we look at that first bullet point there, resisting the idea of meaning, resisting the idea of intention and purpose, that's a paradoxical thing for an artist to do. Why is the artist doing what they're doing? Morris insisted that was a silly question to ask. He just refused it altogether. Part of that undoubtedly has to do with the personal psychology of the man, but it also gets to something deeply important in the philosophy of art. What is the artist doing? What is the artist? Why the artist? Is there even a reason? These minimalists suggest that the artist doesn't have to try to be an artist in some sort of sense. They just have to sort of lose themselves in the process. Yes, these kinds of interiors and spaces that he produces very similar to Judd. And then he starts moving away from that I mentioned installation. Morris, I think, has a good claim to be one of the founders of installation art, also of performance pieces. As I say, conceptual art in general definitely is a subgenre of minimalism. And he even made earthworks. So here he is in his sort of, if you will, classical minimalist phase. I guess we can say that now. Morris. And then he goes to these mirrored cubes and what they are doing with space. He has a lot of, and sometimes really quite successful forays with these mirrored surfaces. He also makes mirrored surfaces that he hangs from cables and other things. And then very much, as I say there, in a Dadaist spirit, he also just sort of deliberately tries to explode some of these conventions. Even, you've got, I mean, in terms of theories of art in the 20th century, the institutional theory, of course, is one of the most popular. It's a very 20th century sort of theory to have, which says that there are these conventions that define these institutions, and what makes an object or an object of art is that it gets into these institutions, and these institutions curate it. That's all normative and conventional. I think that's circular. I think that's an incoherent theory, but that's what these artists are pressuring and interrogating here, those kinds of ideas. Nowadays, we see these kinds of things all the time, but Morris was working with this kind of, for example, random distributions. He has these cloth hangings that are actually quite nice, a lot of them, very early on. Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. This is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It's probably the iconic earthwork. Nowadays, there are a lot of these earthworks. They're very fine. Some of them are very moving and very interesting and fun. That one's been there for a long time, over 50 years. And Christo has also had great success, I think, in these monumental wrapping works that he does with large sections of fabric. The Reichstag in Berlin. Okay. So today it's just been a basic introduction. What do we want to understand with minimalism? What is that? Well, how come? What's going on? What are the ideas? What's the conversation these people are having? Why am I here for that? Well, because I like to look at art, and I found this stuff they called minimalist art, and I thought it was really interesting and quite beautiful. And so I include it now when I'm showing things to you. That's how it works. I show you stuff that I think is interesting and that I think is beautiful. That's what's fun about it. Okay.